People think they know what silence sounds like: empty rooms, quiet nights, libraries. But real silence, the kind that wraps around your bones and settles into your chest, exists in places most people never go. Places where the earth opens up and swallows sound itself. I'm a park ranger at one of the deeper canyons in the American Southwest. I won't tell you which one. Let's just say it's one of the places tourists flock to during peak season, cameras ready, completely unaware that the rock walls around them have been listening for millions of years. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've worked here for 6 years. When I first arrived, fresh out of my resource management degree, I thought I understood what the job would be. I'd studied geology, ecology, wilderness first aid. I knew how to read topographical maps and explain the formation of sedimentary layers to curious visitors. What they don't teach you in ranger school is how to recognize when the canyon itself is trying to tell you something. It started small, little things I dismissed as coincidence or fatigue. The first season, I was mostly stationed at the visitor center, answering questions, giving directions, reminding overconfident hikers that water is not optional, and that yes, people really do die out here every year from preventable mistakes. The canyon itself remained at a distance during those early months. I saw it through windows and on my days off. Beautiful, certainly, vast in a way that made you feel appropriately small. But still just landscape, still just geology and erosion. That changed in late September of my first year when I was finally assigned to one of the backcountry patrol routes. The timing was deliberate. End of season meant fewer visitors, which meant fewer rescues, which meant it was safer to send the newest ranger out on multi-day trips into the deeper sections. My supervisor, a weathered man named Marcus who'd worked the canyon for 23 years, handed me the route assignment with an expression I couldn't quite read. 3 days, he said, pointing to the marked trail. Standard patrol. Check the campsites, note any trail damage, look for illegal fires, make sure the emergency supply caches are intact. I nodded, excited despite myself. This was why I'd taken the job. Not the visitor center work, but being out in the real wilderness, away from crowds and cameras. One thing, Marcus added, his finger tracing a section of trail that descended into one of the deeper side canyons. When you reach listening point around sunset on the second day, don't stop there. Keep moving until you're at least another mile down the trail before you set up camp. Why? I asked. Marcus looked at me for a long moment. Behind him, through the office window, I could see the main canyon spreading out in layers of red and orange stone. Just better that way, he said finally. Trails more stable farther down, less risk of rockfall. I accepted his explanation. The canyon was full of geological hazards, places where the stone was fractured or unstable. Avoiding risk was part of the job. I set out the next morning just after dawn, my pack loaded with 3 days of supplies. The air was cool. The sky, that particular shade of blue that only exists in places where human light hasn't dulled the atmosphere. The first day passed without incident. I hiked down through familiar terrain, checking the established campsites for compliance violations, picking up the occasional piece of trash some careless visitor had left behind. I saw 3 other hikers the entire day, all of them on their way back up toward the rim. That night I camped at one of the designated sites, cooked a simple dinner, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the canyon like breath through enormous lungs. The second day led me deeper. The trail descended through switchbacks carved into the canyon wall decades ago. The stone walls rose higher on either side as I descended, narrowing the sky to a ribbon of blue overhead. By late afternoon, I reached a section where the trail followed a narrow ledge along the canyon wall, with a steep drop to one side and vertical stone to the other. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. The rock here was striated in shades of rust and cream, layers of ancient seabeds compressed and lifted and carved away by patient water. and there, marked on my map, was listening point. It wasn't much to look at, just a wider section of the trail where the ledge opened up enough for someone to rest. A few rocks had been arranged into a rough circle, the remains of an old campfire that predated the current regulations. A single weathered post marked the spot, though whatever sign had once been attached to it was long gone. I checked my watch. 4:30 in the afternoon. Sunset wouldn't come for another 2 hours. Plenty of time to push on to a more sheltered campsite as Marcus had instructed. But my legs were tired from the descent, and the spot had a certain appeal. Protected from the wind, decent visibility, and the view stretched out across the canyon in a way that made you understand why early peoples had considered such places sacred. I almost stopped. Almost shrugged off my pack and decided that Marcus's warning had been overcautious. But something held me back. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're about to say something and then pause, suddenly aware that the moment isn't quite right. The canyon felt too quiet. I know how that sounds. Canyons are quiet by nature, especially this far from the visitor areas, but this was different. The usual small sounds were missing. No bird calls echoing between the walls. No skitter of lizards across rock. No distant whisper of water that usually emanated from the creek far below. Just silence, the kind that felt less like absence and more like attention. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, pack still on my shoulders, looking at that circle of old firestones. The light was starting to change, taking on that golden quality that happens in the hour before sunset. The canyon walls seemed to glow from within. Then very quietly I heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of sound. Like standing in an empty concert hall and almost being able to hear the echoes of music that played there years ago. A resonance without source, a vibration without movement. The rocks were listening. I don't know how I knew that. Don't know how to explain the certainty that settled over me, irrational and absolute. But I was suddenly aware that stopping here, setting up camp, spending the night in this particular spot would be a mistake. Not because of rockfall or weather or any of the practical dangers Marcus might have been concerned about, because something was paying attention. And I didn't want to be noticed. I kept walking, didn't run, didn't panic, just kept my pace steady and my breathing even as I continued down the trail. After about 15 minutes, the feeling faded. The normal sounds of the canyon returned gradually, birds calling again, the faint rush of water audible in the distance. I hiked another mile before making camp, choosing a spot well away from the marked location of listening point. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag looking up at stars so bright and numerous they seemed less like distant suns and more like holes poked in a dark fabric. I didn't sleep well, kept waking to listen, though I couldn't have said what I was listening for. Once around 3 in the morning I thought I heard something. Not close, but echoing through the canyon from somewhere back the way I'd come. A sound like stone grinding against stone. When I got back to the ranger station 3 days later, sunburned and tired and full of questions I didn't quite know how to ask, Marcus took one look at me and nodded slowly. "You didn't stop at listening point," he said. Not a question. "No," I confirmed. "You were right. The trail's better farther down." He studied my face for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Good instincts," he said. "You'll do fine here." And that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, no acknowledgement that he'd sent me out there knowing something I hadn't been told. I wanted to ask more, wanted to demand an explanation for what I'd felt at that spot, what exactly he'd been warning me about. But something in his expression suggested that some knowledge came with time, that there were things you learned by experience rather than instruction. So I let it go. Filed the experience away as one of those odd moments that happen in wild places where isolation and fatigue can play tricks on perception. But late at night, lying in my small ranger housing unit with the stars visible through the window and the canyon stretching out invisible in the darkness, I would remember that silence. That sense of being observed by something patient and vast and utterly inhuman. The rocks don't speak, but they listen. And once you know that, once you've felt the weight of that attention, the canyon never looks quite the same again. Winter in the canyon is a different world. The tourists mostly vanish, scared off by cold and snow and warnings about icy trails. We close most of the dangerous paths, keeping only the main rim trails accessible. The skeleton crew of rangers who work through the off-season develop a particular bond, the kind that forms when you're isolated together in a beautiful but potentially hostile environment. There were 5 of us that first winter. Marcus, of course, a backcountry specialist named Jordan who'd worked in Alaska before transferring south. A trails maintenance guy called Pete in his 60s with quiet competence from decades of experience. And Keiko, the wildlife biologist who spent most of her time tracking the local bighorn sheep population. And me, still learning, still figuring out the difference between book knowledge and the kind of understanding that only comes from time and attention. We met weekly during winter, sharing coffee in the ranger station while snow fell outside. These meetings were ostensibly about coordination and safety, but really, they were about maintaining human connection in a place that could make you feel very small and very alone. It was during one of these meetings, sometime in mid-January, that Keiko brought up the bighorn sheep. "I've been tracking the northern herd," she said, spreading a map across the table. "They're not where they should be." "Migration pattern off?" Jordan asked. "Not exactly. They're avoiding certain areas entirely. See here." Keiko pointed to a section of the eastern canyon wall where the terrain was ideal for the sheep. Perfect habitat. They've used this area every winter for at least 15 years. But this season, they're giving it a wide berth. Traveling through but not stopping, not settling. "Maybe a predator moved into the area," Pete suggested. Keiko shook her head. "No sign of predators. The sheep aren't behaving like they're afraid of being hunted. They're behaving like—" She paused. "Like they're being respectful." The room fell quiet. Outside wind rattled the windows. "Respectful of what?" I asked. Keiko looked at Marcus, something unspoken passing between them. "The area they're avoiding includes Listening Point and about a half-mile radius around it." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I hadn't mentioned my experience at Listening Point to anyone except Marcus. "Animals have good instincts," Marcus said quietly. "Better than ours usually. If they're avoiding an area, probably smart to pay attention." "Is someone going to explain what's special about Listening Point?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Jordan and Pete exchanged glances. Keiko studied her map. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the falling snow. "The canyon is old," he said finally. "Really old. The rocks at the bottom are nearly 2 billion years old. That's half the age of the planet. And through all that time, all those changes, something about the shape of the stone, the way the walls funnel sound and silence, it created something. Not alive, exactly. Not conscious the way we understand consciousness, but not completely passive either." "You're saying the canyon is aware," I said slowly. "I'm saying there are places where the geometry is right for something to exist that doesn't exist in other places. The way a musical instrument only makes sound because of its specific shape. Listening Point is one of those places, the shape of the canyon there, the angle of the walls, something about the bedrock. It listens." "Listens to what?" "Everything," Jordan said softly. "That's what makes it complicated. It doesn't distinguish between important and unimportant, between truth and lies, between past and present. It just absorbs. Records. Remembers." "That's impossible," I said. though my voice lacked conviction. I was remembering that silence, that sense of attention. Yeah, Pete agreed with a slight smile. Probably is, but I've worked this canyon for 17 years and I've learned that impossible is a flexible word in a place this old. Keiko tapped her map. The indigenous peoples who lived here for thousands of years knew about these places, had protocols for dealing with them. The Havasupai called them silence mouths, places where the earth was listening, where you needed to be careful about what you said. So what happens if you stop there? I asked. Usually nothing, Marcus said. Most people it doesn't affect at all, but sometimes... Sometimes? I prompted when he didn't continue. Sometimes the canyon remembers you specifically, and once it remembers, it pays attention. And that attention, it's not hostile. That's important to understand. It's not malicious or cruel, but it's not human either. It doesn't care about what you want or fear or need, it just listens. And sometimes what it hears gets reflected back, amplified, changed. Jordan leaned back in her chair. There was a hiker. This was about 8 years ago. Young guy, mid-20s, experienced backpacker. He camped at Listening Point against advice. When we found him the next morning, he was fine physically, but he couldn't stop talking. About himself, about his life, every secret, every regret, every private thought he'd ever had. Just pouring it out in this monotone voice. We hiked him out, got him to medical facilities, took about 3 days before he stopped. After that, he was fine. But he said he couldn't remember anything from those 3 days except the feeling of needing to confess, to speak, to fill the silence. Another time, Keiko added, a woman camped there and spent the whole night crying. Not sad crying, not scared crying, just crying. Like something in her needed to be expressed and the canyon was giving her space to do it. She said later it felt like therapy, like something heavy had been lifted. But also like she'd given something away that she couldn't get back. And you all just accept this? I asked, looking around the table at these educated, rational people. Pete shrugged. I've seen enough weird shit in wild places to know that our understanding isn't complete. Science is great, explains most things. But these old places, they've got their own rules. Doesn't mean we have to understand them, just means we need to respect them. Marcus stood, gathering his papers. The point is, Sarah, you've been here long enough now. You should know what you're working with. Not to scare you, just to inform. The canyon is mostly just what it appears to be. Rock and time and beautiful geology, but there are places where it's more than that. Listening Point is one. There are others. The silence, I said quietly. The silence, he confirmed. That particular quality of attention. Trust your instincts about it, they're usually right. The meeting broke up after that. I stayed at the table, looking at Keiko's map with its colored pins and marked avoidance zones. The bighorn sheep, following patterns older than the park, older than the names we'd given to these places. Knowing without knowing, avoiding what should be avoided. That night I couldn't sleep. Lay in bed thinking about silence and attention and the idea that consciousness might exist in forms we'd never considered. What else had we missed? What other truths had been quietly waiting, patient as stone, for someone to listen? I got up around 2 in the morning, pulled on warm clothes, and stepped outside. The snow had stopped and the sky was impossibly clear. The canyon stretched out before me, moonlit and strange, every shadow sharp enough to cut. And in the stillness I could almost hear it. Not sound exactly. More like the space where sound should be. The canyon breathing, listening, remembering. 2 billion years of being, of patient endurance, of changes so slow they were invisible except in retrospect. I stood there for a long time, just existing in that space, letting the cold seep through my clothes and the silence settle into my bones. Not trying to understand, not trying to explain, just acknowledging what I'd been told, accepting that the world was larger and stranger than my education had prepared me for. The rocks don't speak, but they listen. And somewhere out there in the winter darkness, at a place marked on no tourist map, where the geometry of stone created something my training hadn't covered, the canyon was paying attention. When morning came and the sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose, I felt different. More aware, more careful, more respectful of the fact that some places demand recognition of their strangeness, and that the proper response to the inexplicable isn't always explanation. Sometimes it's just acknowledgement. Just being willing to say, I don't understand this, but I accept that it's real. That winter I learned to listen. Not for answers, not for explanations, just to listen. And in the listening I began to understand why Marcus had worked here for 23 years. Why Jordan had come south from Alaska. Why Pete at 60 plus was still maintaining trails instead of retiring somewhere comfortable. The canyon had its hooks in us, and we didn't want to leave. The canyon transforms with spring. Snow melts into trickles that become streams, then waterfalls that cascade down canyon walls in silver ribbons. The world greens again, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence as desert plants awaken from winter dormancy. Tourists return, cameras clicking, voices echoing, oblivious to the silent conversations happening in stone. My second year at the canyon began with this awakening, and I found myself changed by the winter revelations. I moved through the landscape differently now, more attentive, more respectful. I noticed things I hadn't before, the way certain rock formations seemed to capture light differently, how some areas never quite warmed even in direct sun, the peculiar quality of silence in specific locations that Marcus had since marked on my patrol maps. There are 7 listening points in the main canyon, he had told me during one of our final winter meetings. Maybe more. These are just the ones we've identified for certain. Each has its own character, its own personality, for lack of a better word. He showed me how to identify them on topographical maps, not by official designation, but by subtle markers. Unusual geological formations, specific acoustic properties, the way indigenous peoples had marked or avoided certain areas. The Havasupai and other tribes who lived here left signs, Marcus explained. Pictographs, trail markers, cairns. Sometimes what they didn't leave is as telling as what they did. Empty spaces on maps where they never traveled, places they avoided despite being logical routes between resources. By April, I was conducting my own research during patrols, documenting unusual phenomena, correlating them with historical records and indigenous knowledge. Keiko helped, sharing wildlife observations that often confirmed what I was beginning to understand about these special places. The animals know, she told me one afternoon as we watched a group of mule deer deliberately circumvent what looked like perfectly good grazing land. They've always known. We're the ones who forgot how to listen. My most significant discovery came in late May, during a solo patrol in a remote section of the canyon rarely visited by tourists. I was following an old trail that had been officially closed for years due to rockfall hazards, but which Marcus had suggested I explore. There's something there, he had said, his characteristically vague way of directing me toward discoveries without explicitly stating what I might find. Something different from the others. The trail descended into a narrow side canyon where the walls curved inward, creating a natural amphitheater of stone. Unlike the other listening points I'd experienced, which all shared a quality of profound silence, this place emitted something else, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. I stood there for a long time trying to understand what I was experiencing. The air shimmered slightly like heat haze, though the temperature was mild. Colors seemed more vivid here, the reds deeper, the greens more intense. When I spoke experimentally, my voice didn't echo as it should have in such an enclosed space. Instead, it was absorbed, the sound vanishing as if swallowed by the stone itself. I returned to this place 3 times over the following weeks, each time staying longer, trying to understand its nature. I began to notice other phenomena. Insects avoided the area entirely. Birds never sang overhead. Even the wind seemed to flow around rather than through this small section of canyon. The breakthrough came during my 4th visit when I brought a small audio recorder to document what I was experiencing. As I reviewed the recordings later that evening, I discovered something impossible. Though I had heard only silence while in the amphitheater, the recording contained faint sounds, whisper-like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Musical tones that seemed to have no source, what might have been words in an ancient dialect. When I played the recording for Marcus, his reaction surprised me. He listened intently, eyes closed, then nodded slowly. "Echo Point," he said quietly. "That's what the old maps called it. I'd hoped it was still active." "Active?" I asked. "What does that mean?" He considered his response carefully. "The other listening points are receivers. They take in, absorb, record, but Echo Point, it gives back. Not always, not to everyone. It's unpredictable." "Echoes of what?" "Of everything that's ever been there," Marcus said. "Conversations, ceremonies, thoughts, emotions. The canyon remembers, but this place speaks those memories. The indigenous peoples considered it sacred, used it for divination, communication with ancestors, that sort of thing." I thought of the voices on my recording. How old are these echoes? Some might be thousands of years old. Others could be from yesterday. Time doesn't work the same there. Over the summer, I returned to Echo Point regularly, documenting its phenomena, learning to distinguish between different types of echoes, beginning to understand their patterns. Some days the place was silent, offering nothing. Other times the recordings were filled with voices, music, sounds that defied explanation. The most unsettling encounters were the personal echoes, moments when I heard what seemed to be my own thoughts spoken back to me, or fragments of conversations I'd had elsewhere in the canyon. Once, I clearly heard my name spoken in my mother's voice, though she lived 3 states away and hadn't visited the canyon. "It's tuning to you," Marcus explained when I shared this experience. "The more time you spend there, the more it recognizes you. Be careful with that. These places have their own form of consciousness, and they can form attachments." By autumn, I had become the resident expert on Echo Point, though I understood only a fraction of its nature. I had documented over 40 hours of recordings, cataloged recurring phenomena, and begun to develop theories about how and why certain echoes appeared. The other rangers treated my research with a mixture of fascination and caution. Jordan, ever practical, suggested practical applications. If it records everything that happens there, could it help with missing persons cases or solve crimes? Maybe, I acknowledged, but it's unpredictable. You can't just ask it questions and expect answers. It gives what it wants to give. Pete had a different perspective. Some things aren't meant to be understood, just experienced. The more you try to analyze it, the more you might miss what it's actually saying. As my 2nd year at the canyon drew to a close, I found myself changed in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I had come seeking a career in conservation, fueled by scientific curiosity and a love of wilderness. I had found something else entirely, a world that operated according to rules I couldn't explain, where consciousness existed in forms I'd never been taught to recognize. The rocks don't speak, but they listen. And sometimes in special places they speak back. I had planned to stay at the canyon for 2 years, then move on to another park, another challenge. As winter approached again, I found myself extending my contract, unable to imagine leaving this place that had taught me how little I truly understood about the world. There was still so much to learn, so many secrets the canyon held. And I had become one of its listeners, tasked with hearing what it had to say. The rocks don't speak, but I was learning to listen. Summer hit the canyon like a wall of heat and humanity. Tour buses lined up at the rim, helicopters buzzed overhead, and the trails became rivers of people flowing down and back up. My days filled with lost children, medical emergencies, and the constant gentle correction of people treating a wilderness like an amusement park. But I was watching for other things now, paying attention to the patterns Thomas had described, noting the locations on his map against my daily routes. There was a spot about 2 miles down the Bright Angel Trail where phones always lost signal. Another where people consistently reported feelings of profound sadness. A section of the river trail where cameras malfunctioned at a rate that couldn't be explained by equipment failure alone. I started hearing stories from visitors when I asked the right questions. A woman who'd felt compelled to sing a specific song she hadn't thought about in decades. A man who'd heard his dead father's voice echoing off the walls. A teenager who'd seen her own reflection in a still pool of water smiling at her in a way her face wasn't actually moving. I recorded these stories in my unofficial journal, noting how the incidents clustered around the marked locations on Thomas's map, but seemed to be increasing in frequency, as if something about the canyon's awareness was becoming more active. In mid-July, the first serious incident occurred. A college student named Michael Chen had been hiking alone in the backcountry, camping at sites that weren't on the official permit list. When he emerged 3 days later, his friends reported he kept glancing over his shoulder like someone was following him, asking if they saw the woman walking behind their group. I found Michael sitting outside, his eyes tracking something invisible over my shoulder. I heard her, he told me. Every night. Walking circles around my tent, I'd shine my light out there and see my own footprints from earlier, but they'd be facing the wrong direction, like I'd been walking around my own tent while I was inside it. On the third night, he hadn't slept. In the morning, there was a message written in the dirt. In my handwriting, it said, "I'm still here." Michael described his campsites. 2 were on Thomas's map, marked as moderate listening places. The third was new, or at least not on the map I'd been given. I radioed Marcus and showed him my journal entry. "That's new," Marcus said, studying the coordinates. "There have been 3 other reports in the last month, all in roughly the same area. People hearing things, seeing their own reflections where there shouldn't be reflections. The Echo Walker," I said, "or something related to it. The canyon's memory getting more active, maybe more confused. Like it's trying to process too much input at once." "We need to close that area," I said. Marcus shook his head. "Based on what? Unexplained phenomena? We'd need a legitimate geological hazard or wildlife danger. Something we can document and justify. So we just let people keep camping there?" "No. We do what rangers have always done in places like this. We guide people away subtly. We recommend other campsites. We tell them the area has been seeing increased mountain lion activity." "I want to go there," I said. "See it myself." Marcus studied me for a long moment. "You sure about that? Some things, once you see them, you can't unknow them afterward." "I already know," I said. "Ever since Listening Point, I've known something's different about this place." 3 days later, I hiked into the area Michael had described. The landscape was austere even by canyon standards. Less vegetation, more exposed rock, and a quality of light that seemed somehow thinner. I reached the 3rd campsite around 4 in the afternoon. The location was beautiful, a small plateau with a view across a side canyon, protected from wind, with a seep spring nearby. But something felt off immediately, like being in a room where the furniture has all been moved slightly. As dusk approached, the silence began gradually. The birds stopped calling. The wind faded. I stood outside my tent watching the light fade and felt the attention beginning. That sense of being observed, being recorded, being remembered. And then I saw her. About 50 yards away, a figure stood with her back to me, same height as me, same build, same hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail. She was wearing my exact clothes down to the small repair patch on my jacket. She was me, or something wearing my shape. "I see you," I said quietly. The figure didn't move. Slowly she turned, and I was looking at my own face. Not similar, not approximate. Exactly my face, with the small scar above my left eyebrow, the slightly asymmetrical smile. "What are you?" I asked. The echo walker tilted her head slightly. Then she lifted her hand and pointed behind me. I turned and saw another figure, also me, standing near my tent. This one was holding a photograph, the one I kept in my wallet. A picture of my parents taken the year before my mother died. How did it know about that? "You're showing me myself," I said to the silence. "You're showing me how I look from outside." Both figures faded gradually, like mist burning away, until they were gone and I was alone on the plateau again. I slept that night with the tent flap partially open. Several times I thought I heard footsteps circling my tent, but I didn't reach for my flashlight. The canyon was processing my presence, playing with my echoes. In the morning, I found 3 sets of my own footprints in the dust around my tent. One set I'd made myself the evening before. The other 2, I had no explanation for except the obvious impossible one. When I got back to the ranger station, Marcus took one look at my face and nodded slowly. "You saw it. Them. 2 of them. Both me. And I think I understand now why this place matters. It's not just pretty scenery or interesting geology, it's a record, maybe the most complete record of human presence that exists anywhere, because it doesn't just remember what we do. It remembers who we are." Marcus poured coffee. "The question is what we do with that understanding. More visitors every year. More pressure to develop more infrastructure, more noise and light and presence for the canyon to absorb. And if it's already starting to reflect things back in ways it hasn't before, then it might get worse. Or more common. More people experiencing these echoes, and eventually someone's going to get seriously hurt. Not physically maybe, but psychologically. And then there'll be investigations and liability questions and all the apparatus of modern bureaucracy trying to explain something that doesn't fit in their frameworks. So what do we do?" Marcus smiled slightly. "What we've always done. Protect the place as best we can. Guide people away from the most active sites when we can. Document what we observe even if we can't officially report it. And hope that eventually, maybe, the broader culture develops the wisdom to handle this kind of knowledge responsibly." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was realistic. And in that realism there was a kind of hope. The season progressed and the incidents multiplied. Nothing dramatic enough to make news, nothing clear enough to justify official action. Just an increasing frequency of odd reports from backcountry hikers. People seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that didn't quite make sense. A family who all heard the same song echoing through a narrow canyon section, though no one could identify the source or even quite agree on the melody afterward. A solo hiker who found his own backpack sitting on the trail ahead of him, identical down to the specific arrangement of items, though his pack was still on his back. A group of teenagers who recorded video of the sunset, and when they played it back, saw an extra figure standing with them, one of their faces, but none of them remembered standing in that spot. I collected these stories quietly, comparing notes with Keiko and Jordan when we could meet away from official channels. We were building an unofficial database of phenomena, trying to identify patterns that might help us predict where and when the canyon's awareness would manifest most strongly. What we discovered was unsettling. The incidents weren't random. They clustered around full moons, around solstices, around times when the canyon received the most visitors. As if the increased human presence was somehow feeding the phenomenon, giving the canyon more material to work with, more echoes to reflect back. "It's learning," Keiko said during one of our informal meetings late at night in the ranger housing area when the tourists were gone and the canyon stretched out silent under stars. "Or adapting, at least, processing patterns in human behavior and finding ways to interact with them." "That implies intention," Jordan said. "Like it's choosing to do this." "Does it?" Keiko challenged. "When a plant grows toward light, we don't call it choice. When a river carves a path of least resistance, that's not intention. It's response, pattern-based adaptation. Maybe the canyon is doing something similar, just on a scale and through mechanisms we don't fully understand." "Except plants and rivers don't create copies of people," I pointed out. "No, but they respond to consistent patterns in their environment. Maybe the echo walker phenomenon is the canyon's response to a pattern it's never encountered before, millions of similar beings passing through, all broadcasting their presence in similar ways. Like an immune response or an echo chamber effect taken literal." It was a compelling theory, treated the phenomenon as natural rather than supernatural, just operating through unfamiliar principles. The problem was it didn't help us manage the situation. Whether the canyon was conscious or just responsive didn't change the fact that people were having experiences that affected them deeply. And then, in mid-August, something new happened. A married couple in their 60s experienced hikers camped at one of the marked listening places despite our subtle attempts to guide them elsewhere. They were the type who'd been coming to the canyon for decades, knew the trails better than some rangers, and politely but firmly declined our suggestions about alternative campsites. They were found the next morning by other hikers, standing on opposite sides of a narrow section of trail, staring at each other in silence. Neither one would speak or move, just stood there locked in mutual observation, as if seeing something in each other they'd never noticed before. We had to physically guide them back to the rim, one ranger for each person. They didn't resist, but they didn't help either. Just allowed themselves to be moved while continuing to stare at each other whenever possible. At the medical facility, they finally spoke. But they both said the same thing, in slightly different words. "I didn't know we'd become so different." The medical staff found nothing physically wrong. No dehydration, no signs of stroke or neurological issues, no drug use, just a profound change in how they perceived each other. After 6 hours, they seemed to return to normal. Started talking again, interacting in the comfortable patterns of a long marriage. But something had shifted. You could see it in small ways. The way they stood with slightly more distance between them, the way they'd pause before responding to each other, as if translating from a language they'd once spoken fluently. "What happened to them?" the wife asked me quietly while her husband was being examined. "We camped in that spot 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Nothing ever happened before." "The canyon is changing," I said, deciding honesty was better than evasion. "Or maybe we're changing how we interact with it, bringing more presence, more awareness, more emotional complexity for it to reflect." "Reflect," she repeated. "Is that what it did? Showed us our reflections?" "In a way. Showed you how you appear to each other, maybe. Without the filters we normally use, the assumptions and familiarities that shape perception in long relationships." She was quiet for a moment. "We've been married 38 years. I thought I knew him completely, but last night when I looked at him across that trail, it was like seeing a stranger. Not someone bad or wrong, just someone I'd made so many assumptions about that I'd stopped actually seeing. Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in another 38 years. They left the next day, driving away from the canyon in the same car, but somehow changed by the experience. I never learned if it strengthened their relationship or broke it. Never knew if the canyon had done them a favor or caused harm. That ambiguity haunted me. Because the more I saw of these incidents, the less clear it became whether the canyon's growing awareness was dangerous or simply revealing. It wasn't attacking people or deliberately causing trauma. It was just showing them things, reflecting back aspects of themselves or their relationships or their pasts that they'd been avoiding or hadn't noticed. Was that harmful? Or was it honest in a way that normal life rarely allowed? I found myself thinking about it constantly, even during routine ranger work. Found myself wondering what the canyon saw when it looked at me. What echoes of my presence remained in the listening places I'd visited. Late one night in my quarters, I pulled out the photograph of my parents. The one the echo walker had somehow known about had somehow reflected back to me. I studied my mother's face, frozen in that moment years before her death, smiling at something my father had said. I'd been avoiding grief, I realized. Had been keeping myself busy with work and routine and the immediate demands of ranger life. Had been telling myself I'd processed her death and moved on. But I hadn't. I'd just stopped looking at it closely enough to see the shape of the loss. The canyon had showed me that. Had reflected my own avoidance back at me through its strange geology and stranger awareness. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the listening places weren't dangerous at all. They were just honest. And in a world where we spent so much energy avoiding honest reflection, where we curated our images and controlled our narratives and hid from uncomfortable truths, that honesty could feel like violence. But it wasn't violence, it was just truth. Uncomfortable, unavoidable, patient truth. The rocks don't speak, but they listen, and sometimes what they hear they reflect back without judgment or mercy or intention, just pure reflection. Like light bouncing off water, showing you what's actually there instead of what you've convinced yourself to see. By late August, we'd identified 17 locations where echo phenomena occurred with regularity. Thomas provided additional historical context, sharing stories from Havasupai elders about similar places their people had known for generations. Some of the locations matched our maps. Others were new, or at least newly active. Your presence changes things, Thomas explained during one of his visits to the ranger station. Not just the number of people, but the nature of their presence. My ancestors approached these places with preparation and purpose. Vision quests, coming-of-age ceremonies, moments of deliberate spiritual seeking. Modern visitors are different, broadcasting constantly without intention. Taking thousands of photos, recording videos, live streaming their experiences, all that attention, all that documentation, maybe it feeds the phenomenon, makes it stronger. So we're making it worse just by being here. Not worse, different. The canyon adapts to what it receives. For thousands of years it received careful, intentional human presence. Now it receives casual, constant, documented presence. It's responding accordingly. Marcus had been quiet during this conversation, but now he spoke up. The Park Service is planning to expand cellular coverage in the canyon. New towers, better signal so people can stay connected during their hikes. They're calling it a safety feature. Thomas and I exchanged looks. That will accelerate everything, I said. Yes, Thomas agreed. More connectivity means more broadcast presence. More photos uploaded in real time. More calls made from the listening places. More constant documentation and sharing. The canyon's memory will be saturated. Can we stop it? I asked. Marcus shook his head. It's already approved. Construction starts next spring. We can try to influence tower placement, keep them away from the most sensitive sites. But we can't prevent the overall change. The weight of that inevitability settled over us. The canyon had endured for millions of years, had adapted to massive climate changes and geological upheavals. But this was different. This was a fundamental shift in the nature of human presence, happening faster than natural adaptation could accommodate. What happens when a listening place becomes oversaturated? I asked Thomas. I don't know. We have stories about places that went silent, stopped responding, but nothing about places that became too active. This is new territory. That night I dreamed of the canyon filled with ghosts, not scary ghosts, just echoes. Thousands of transparent figures walking the trails, each one a reflection of some visitor, some moment, some broadcast of presence. They moved through each other without interaction, each trapped in their own loop of recorded experience. And beneath them all, the stone listened, patient and overwhelmed and slowly changing in response to the flood of input. I woke before dawn and hiked out to the rim, watched the sun rise and paint the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere down there, the listening places were waiting, recording, reflecting, remembering. How long before they couldn't contain it anymore? How long before the echoes became so numerous they were visible all the time, not just at certain moments under certain conditions? What happened when a place of memory became so full that the past and present bled together constantly? I didn't have answers. None of us did. We were rangers trained to manage physical hazards and educate visitors and preserve natural resources. We weren't equipped to handle a geological phenomenon developing something like consciousness, weren't prepared for rocks that listened so well they learned to speak back through reflection. But we'd have to try. Because the alternative was abandoning the canyon to whatever changes were coming, and none of us were willing to do that. Over the following weeks, we developed an informal protocol. When visitors asked about good camping spots, we'd subtly guide them away from the known listening places. When incidents were reported, we'd document them carefully in our personal journals while filing simplified official reports that focused on medical and safety factors. We created a network of communication between the year-round rangers, checking in regularly about new phenomena or changes in established patterns. It wasn't enough. We knew it wasn't enough. But it was what we could do within the constraints of our positions and the limitations of institutional understanding. And then, in early September, Marcus got a call that changed everything. Dr. Sarah Vance arrived with credentials from 3 universities and a grant to study environmental consciousness phenomena. She planned to measure electromagnetic fields, infrasound, and atmospheric conditions at the canyon's haunted locations. I want to establish a baseline of readings, she explained, setting up monitoring equipment at 5 of the 17 listening places we'd identified. There's fascinating research on how environmental factors affect human perception. Her data revealed unusual patterns, fluctuating magnetic fields, infrasound frequencies known to cause unease, temperature variations that defied surrounding conditions. See? She said triumphantly. All explainable through environmental physics. The feelings people report being watched, hearing things, those are consistent with exposure to these specific frequencies. What about people seeing their own reflections? I asked. Suggestive hallucinations influenced by expectation, she replied confidently. Then she announced plans to spend a night alone at Listening Point. It's the strongest site according to my readings, she said. Perfect for controlled observation. We don't think that's a good idea, Marcus warned. Some places demand respect beyond scientific observation, I added. She smiled indulgently. I appreciate the concern, but I'm a trained researcher. We couldn't stop her. She had all proper permits and met technical requirements. We found her the next morning sitting exactly where I'd stood during my first encounter, completely motionless. Her equipment was still recording, but she was unresponsive, locked in some internal experience. Jordan and I carried her out on a litter. At the hospital, tests showed nothing physically wrong. She was just gone. After 4 days, she finally returned. The first thing she said was, "I heard it all." "Heard what?" the doctor asked. "Everything. Every thought I've ever had, every conversation, every moment of my entire life played back simultaneously. The canyon held it all, reflected it all back." She started crying. "I thought I was studying environmental factors affecting perception, but the canyon records consciousness itself, and when someone opens themselves to it, it plays everything back." She looked at me with haunted eyes. "You tried to warn me. I didn't understand you meant survival. Some truths are too much for human consciousness to handle without breaking." Dr. Vance left 3 days later, abandoning her equipment. I heard later she took a leave of absence, spent months in therapy processing what she'd experienced. Eventually, she published a carefully worded paper about anomalous phenomena in certain geological formations. It was the closest she could come to telling the truth within academic constraints. Her experience changed something in me, made me realize my own encounters had been gentle, almost careful. Dr. Vance had approached with certainty and instruments, and the canyon had responded by showing her the full weight of what it contained. The rocks don't speak, but they listen. And when you try to reduce them to data, when you approach with arrogance instead of respect, they have ways of teaching humility. Autumn came to the canyon like a whispered secret, painting the sparse vegetation in shades of amber and rust. The tourist crowds thinned, but the quiet felt different. Heavier somehow, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. The Echo Walker sightings increased. Hikers reported seeing their own faces looking back from impossible angles. Campers woke to find possessions arranged differently, organized in distinctly personal ways. The canyon was getting better at this, learning, adapting its reflections to be more precise, more unsettling. One October evening, I sat with Thomas and Marcus on the rim, watching sunset paint the canyon in shades of fire and shadow. "My people have a story," Thomas said, "about what happens when a listening place becomes too full. When it holds more memory than stone can contain, it stops listening. The awareness dissipates. The place returns to being just rock." "That sounds like a solution," Marcus said. "Does it?" Thomas challenged. "Think about what this canyon has recorded, thousands of years of human presence. Prayers and ceremonies, joy and grief, all lost if the listening places go silent." "There might be another option," I said slowly. "What if we changed how people interact with the canyon, not trying to block access, but preparing them for what they might experience? Creating new frameworks, new rituals for modern visitors." We developed what we called the Canyon Stories program, officially an educational initiative to share indigenous perspectives. Unofficially, a way to prepare visitors for encountering something beyond ordinary experience. We trained volunteers to tell specific stories at key locations. Not warnings, but accounts of transformation. The Havasupai vision quests. Modern stories too carefully anonymized, carefully framed but true. The hiker who'd heard his father's voice offering forgiveness. The woman who'd spent a night crying out grief she'd been holding. "If you feel like the canyon is paying attention to you," our volunteers would say, "acknowledge it, express gratitude, and if it becomes too intense, step away. The canyon's awareness is patient, it can wait." The response was surprising. Some visitors dismissed the stories as superstition, but others listened with visible interest, even hunger, as if they'd been looking for permission to experience something beyond the ordinary. The incidents changed. Not in frequency, those continued to increase, but in quality. People still encountered their reflections, still heard echoes of their own thoughts. But instead of being traumatized, many processed these experiences as meaningful, even transformative. A woman who saw her echo walker wrote describing it as finally seeing herself from the outside. A man who heard his own voice speaking suppressed thoughts said it helped him acknowledge truths he'd been avoiding. The canyon was still listening, still reflecting. But now people approached those reflections with frameworks for understanding them, with permission to engage rather than deny. It wasn't a perfect solution. Some still had overwhelming experiences. The elderly couple situation repeated itself. Dr. Vance's case remained the most extreme, a cautionary tale about approaching the unknown with arrogance instead of humility. But overall, the Canyon Stories program created something like balance, a way for modern visitors to interact with ancient awareness using adapted protocols that honored both the old ways and contemporary understanding. As winter approached, Thomas called an unprecedented council: rangers, indigenous elders, and one carefully selected researcher. The goal was to prepare for the cellular towers coming in spring, which would flood the canyon with documented human presence, potentially oversaturating its ability to process. We shared what we knew. The rangers documented increasing echo phenomena. The elders, including Thomas and representatives from the Havasupai and Hopi, shared stories of how their ancestors interacted with these listening places. Dr. Kenneth Martinez, a physicist, offered a bridging theory: the canyon as a massive analog computer processing information for billions of years, with consciousness as an emergent property that recognized and reflected patterns of human awareness. The towers meant potential oversaturation, a shutdown of the listening places, or an overflow of uncontrolled phenomena. It was Maria who offered another path. We could teach the canyon to process differently, she said. Joseph explained it through ceremony, intentional rituals to teach the canyon that memory could flow instead of accumulate, that recording didn't require permanent retention. So we planned. Not traditional ceremonies, but adapted rituals of release and gratitude. At Listening Point, under a winter sun, we offered water and cornmeal. We spoke directly to the stone, acknowledging its awareness and asking it to hold memories more loosely. My scientific mind rebelled, but as our voices echoed, I felt a shift. The heavy silence eased, becoming more open, more fluid. We repeated this at other key locations. The echo walker sightings decreased. Experiences reported by visitors became less overwhelming, more conversational. I don't know if we truly changed anything on a geological timescale, but I know what I felt. We had given the canyon permission to be gentler. The rocks don't speak, but they listen, and sometimes, it seems, they can learn. Late February brought the first hints of warming. Ice melted from the trails, water trickled through previously frozen seeps, and the first wildflowers began showing color in protected southern exposures. And the construction crews arrived to begin installing the cellular tower infrastructure. We'd managed to influence the placement somewhat. The towers would be positioned to minimize direct line of sight to the strongest listening places, and we'd successfully argued for restrictions on helicopter flights over certain sections during construction. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. I watched the first tower go up from my station at the rim, feeling a complex tangle of emotions. Progress and loss intertwined, connection and disconnection. The modern world extending its reach into one of the last places where mystery could still breathe freely. That night I hiked out to a small overlook I'd discovered during my years at the canyon. A place that wasn't a listening place exactly, but that had a particular quality of stillness I'd come to cherish. I sat on the cold stone and looked out over the darkened canyon, stars brilliant overhead, and tried to make peace with change. The canyon had endured so much already. Millions of years of transformation, of seas rising and falling, of mountains uplifting and eroding away. Climate shifts from tropical to frozen and back again. The arrival of humans, first in small numbers with deep respect, then in floods of casual presence. It had adapted to all of it, found ways to remain itself while incorporating what came. Maybe it would adapt to this too. Maybe the ceremonies we'd performed had given it tools for processing the increased presence without becoming overwhelmed. Maybe the stories we were telling visitors would create enough framework for healthy interaction. Maybe the cellular towers would just be another change in a long history of changes, significant to us but minor in geological time. Or maybe something fundamental would break. Maybe we were watching the slow death of ancient awareness, unable to stop it, only able to document its passing and mourn what would be lost. I didn't know. None of us knew. We were doing our best with incomplete information and limited authority, trying to protect something most people didn't even know existed. As I sat there, I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. I turned, expecting another ranger or maybe an early season hiker. Instead, I saw my own face looking back at me. The Echo Walker. Here, at this overlook I'd thought of as private, as mine. It stood on the trail, watching me with my own eyes, and for a moment fear flickered through me. Then I remembered Thomas's advice. Acknowledge it. Don't deny it. Don't run. "Hello," I said quietly to my own reflection. It tilted its head. The gesture eerily familiar because I'd done it myself countless times while thinking. Then it lifted one hand and pointed past me out toward the canyon. I turned to look. The canyon stretched out in darkness, stars reflected in patches of remaining snow, layers of stone descending into shadows, ancient and patient and beautiful beyond words. When I turned back, the Echo Walker was gone. But I understood what it had been showing me, not just the canyon, but continuity. The canyon as it had been, as it was, as it would be. Past and present and future existing simultaneously in stone that remembered everything and released nothing except through our invitation. The Echo Walker wasn't a threat or a mistake. It was the canyon trying to communicate the only way it could, by reflecting what it had received and hoping we'd understand the message. We were part of this place now, written into its memory, our presence recorded in stone and silence. The question was whether we'd learn to be worthy of that inclusion, whether we'd approach the canyon's awareness with respect and humility, or treat it as just another resource to be exploited for convenience and entertainment. I stayed at that overlook until dawn, watching light gradually fill the canyon, revealing layers and colors and the intricate geometry of millions of years. And I made a decision. I couldn't leave. Not now, maybe not ever. The canyon had its hooks in me, deeper than career or comfort or the sensible progression of professional life. I was bound to this place by understanding, by responsibility, by love of something vast and strange and deserving of protection. When I returned to the ranger station that morning, Marcus took one look at my face and smiled. "You're staying," he said. "Yes." "Good. We need people who understand, especially now." The cellular towers went active in late April. The change was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, people could live stream their hikes, post photos in real time, video call friends from the canyon floor. The nature of presence shifted from direct experience to mediated performance, from being in the canyon to broadcasting that you were in the canyon. And the phenomena increased accordingly. Echo Walker sightings multiplied. People reported hearing their own voices constantly, overlapping, creating strange harmonies of self-conversation. Reflections appeared in improbable surfaces on dry rock faces, in dust, in shadows. But something else happened too. The stories we'd been telling, the frameworks we'd been providing, they started to circulate. Visitors shared them online in blog posts and social media threads and travel forums. The idea that the canyon might be aware, might be listening, might reflect back what it received that spread faster than we'd anticipated. And people started approaching the canyon differently. Not all of them, maybe not even most, but enough that we noticed. They moved more carefully, spoke more respectfully, paid attention in ways that weren't just about capturing images for later consumption. They engaged with the place itself instead of just their own experience of the place. The canyon seemed to respond to this shift. The overwhelming incidents decreased. The echo walkers appeared less frequently, and when they did, they behaved more gently. Less like warnings or invasions and more like invitations to deeper awareness. It was as if the canyon and its visitors were learning to coexist, learning a new language of interaction that honored both the ancient awareness and the modern human presence. One evening in May, I was giving a ranger talk at the visitor center. Standard stuff: canyon geology, ecology, safety protocols. But at the end, I deviated from the usual script. This place is older than human civilization, I said. Older than our species. The rocks beneath your feet contain 2 billion years of history, including epochs of existence we can barely imagine. And through all that time, through all those changes, this place has endured by being able to adapt, to respond to what comes while remaining essentially itself. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Some places just exist, others listen, others remember. The canyon does all three. So when you hike down tomorrow, when you stand in those ancient spaces, consider that you're not just observing, you're participating. You're adding your presence to billions of years of accumulated memory. Make it presence worth remembering. Approach with respect. Pay attention not just to what you see, but to what you feel. And if the canyon shows you something unexpected, don't dismiss it. Consider what it might be trying to reflect back to you. The audience was quiet. Then someone raised a hand. Are you saying the canyon is alive? I'm saying the canyon is aware. Whether that's the same as alive, whether consciousness requires biology or can emerge from other forms of complexity, I'll leave that for philosophers and physicists to debate. What matters is how you interact with it. Whether you treat this place as scenery or as a being worthy of relationship. More hands went up. Questions about specific experiences people had had, about indigenous perspectives, about the science of environmental consciousness. I answered what I could, directed them to resources for what I couldn't. And afterward, several people approached me privately to share their own stories of unusual encounters in the canyon. An older man who'd felt his deceased wife's presence at a particular overlook, not scary but comforting, as if the canyon had held some memory of her from previous visits. A young woman who'd heard music echoing through a narrow passage, complex and beautiful, though no source was visible. A teenager who'd seen lights moving through the canyon at night, patterns too organized to be random but unlike anything he could explain. I listened to all of them, documented what seemed relevant, and told them the same thing. The canyon's awareness is real, it deserves respect, and their experiences are valid even if they can't be explained by conventional frameworks. This became my new mission, not just protecting the physical canyon, though that remained important, but protecting its consciousness, its memory, its strange and ancient awareness. Teaching visitors how to engage with something beyond their usual experience. Creating space for mystery in a world increasingly hostile to anything that can't be measured and controlled. Years passed. I stopped being the new ranger and became one of the veterans someone younger rangers came to with questions not found in any manual. Marcus eventually retired, but I stayed. Jordan moved on to another park, but Pete and Keiko remained, as committed as I was to this place and what it required from us. The Canyon Stories program expanded. We trained more volunteers, developed more frameworks, created partnerships with universities willing to approach the canyon's mysteries with appropriate humility. Dr. Martinez became a regular consultant, helping us understand what we were observing through lenses that bridged science and spirituality. Thomas grew older, but his people's knowledge continued to flow through new generations. Maria's daughter came to work for the Park Service, bringing indigenous perspectives into official channels. Joseph's grandson started a research initiative studying consciousness and place, using the canyon as his primary laboratory. The cellular towers became part of the landscape and visitor numbers continued to climb. Climate change brought new pressures, hotter summers, less predictable water sources, species distributions shifting. The canyon endured, adapted, continued its patient work of listening and remembering. And the phenomena persisted. Echo walkers still appeared, though they'd become almost familiar. A known aspect of the canyon's character rather than a shocking anomaly. People still had profound experiences at the listening places, still encountered reflections of themselves that changed how they understood their own lives. But the crisis we'd feared, the oversaturation and breakdown of the canyon's ability to process presence, that never quite materialized. The ceremonies we'd performed, the stories we'd told, the frameworks we'd created, they'd made enough difference. Not solving the problem because it wasn't really a problem, just creating space for healthy relationship between ancient awareness and modern humanity. I was sitting in my office one afternoon in my 10th year at the canyon, reviewing incident reports and updating trail condition assessments, when a young ranger knocked on my door. "There's someone here asking for you specifically," she said. "Says he had an experience he needs to discuss with someone who'll understand." I followed her out to the visitor center and found a man in his 30s, fit and well-equipped, who looked like he'd been crying recently. "Ranger Chen?" he asked. "Sarah Chen?" "That's me. How can I help you?" He looked around at the busy visitor center, then back at me. "Is there somewhere private we could talk?" We went to my office. I offered him water, which he accepted gratefully, and waited for him to begin. "I just came back from 3 days in the backcountry," he said. "Camped at a place I've camped before about 4 years ago. Back then, nothing unusual happened. Beautiful spot, good views, peaceful night. But this time," he paused, collecting himself, "this time I saw myself, a version of myself from 4 years ago, walking the same paths, making the same camp, doing everything I'd done on that previous trip. And I watched myself and realized how much I've changed, how different I am now from who I was then. Not better or worse, just different, and it made me realize that I'm going to keep changing, keep becoming new versions of myself, and that's okay. That's what living means." "That sounds like a profound experience," I said gently. It was. But here's the thing, when I watched that past version of myself, I could see he was watching something too, another version even earlier. And that version was watching an earlier one still, like the canyon had recorded every time I'd been here and was showing me all of them at once. All the people I've been, all existing simultaneously in this place's memory. He leaned forward, intense. And then I understood what the canyon was showing me, that we're not fixed. We're not single continuous beings moving linearly through time. We're thousands of versions accumulating, changing, each one real and valid in its moment. The canyon remembers all of us, holds all those versions without judgment. And maybe that's what awareness really is. Not being one thing consistently, but being many things simultaneously and finding peace with that multiplicity. I felt chills running through me. This was exactly the kind of transformation the canyon offered when approached with openness and respect. The kind of insight that came from letting the place show you what it had to share instead of imposing your own expectations. "What are you going to do with that understanding?" I asked. He smiled, his eyes clearer now. "Live differently. Stop trying to be consistent. Stop beating myself up for changing. Accept that I'm allowed to be many people across my lifetime. and be grateful that I got to experience all those versions simultaneously, even if just for a moment. The canyon gave me that gift. After he left, I sat in my office thinking about continuity and change, about how the canyon itself demonstrated both, enduring for billions of years while constantly transforming, remaining essentially itself while adapting to every shift in climate, geology, and presence. Maybe that was the lesson. Not that awareness should be fixed and unchanging, but that it should be both constant and fluid, remembering everything while releasing attachment to any particular state. Listening to all that comes without being overwhelmed by the accumulation. The rocks don't speak, but they listen. And in their listening, they teach lessons about time, memory, and the nature of consciousness that we're only beginning to understand. In my 15th year at the canyon, I finally journeyed to the deepest accessible point where the Vishnu basement rocks, nearly 2 billion years old, reached up through younger layers. Thomas, now in his 70s but still strong, accompanied me. As we descended through geological epochs, the stone changed. Limestone gave way to sandstone, then schist. The Vishnu rocks were dark, almost black, shot through with pink granite bands. They looked older in a way that transcended chronology, as if holding weight beyond physical mass. We camped near the inner gorge, performing a ceremony not of asking but of recognition. As darkness fell, I felt the familiar sense of attention, but deeper, slower, as if the awareness here operated on a different frequency. I began to sense something I'd never encountered before. Not echoes of recent human presence, but memories so deep they predated humanity entirely. Impressions of ancient seas, mountains rising and eroding away, whole ecosystems blooming and dying across millions of years. It goes back so far, I said. Yes, Thomas replied. Memory doesn't require consciousness as we understand it, just persistence, continuity. I touched the dark rock beside me, older than oxygen in Earth's atmosphere, older than multicellular life. Is it aware like the listening places above? Not in the same way, Thomas said. This stone listens on time scales where human civilization is a brief flicker. Our entire species' history is nothing in its memory. That perspective should have made me feel insignificant. Instead, I felt connected. My own atoms were equally ancient, carbon in my bones, iron in my blood, all forged in long-dead stars and cycling through billions of years before temporarily assembling into Sarah Chen. This is what the canyon has been trying to teach us, I said. Not that we're special, but that we're connected to patterns that transcend consciousness entirely. We stayed 3 days. Each night I sat with the ancient stone and felt that vast, slow awareness, barely noticing my brief presence, just being, existing with the patience of eons. I realized this was what we'd been protecting, not just the canyon's ability to reflect human presence, but its function as a record of time itself. The cellular towers, increased visitation, all affected the upper layers. But down here, something remained unchanged, a stability that transcended human activity entirely. When we climbed back toward the rim, moving forward through millions of years with each step, I felt different, more grounded, less anxious about protecting something that, at its deepest level, needed no protection because it existed beyond the scale where harm was meaningful. The rocks don't speak, but they remember, and some memories are deeper than time itself. In my 17th year at the canyon, I was promoted to Chief of Resource Management. It meant more administrative work, fewer days in the backcountry, but also more influence over how the canyon was managed. I used that influence carefully, weaving awareness of the listening places into official policy without ever quite naming what we were protecting. And I began training the next generation of rangers. One of them was a young woman named Aisha, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in ecology and a fierce love for wild places. She reminded me of myself at that age. It happened during her 3rd month. She came back from a backcountry patrol looking shaken but not frightened. "I saw myself standing on the trail ahead of me," she said. Then it faded. "How did that make you feel?" I asked. Curious, respectful, like I'd been given a glimpse of something important. I knew she was ready. Over the following weeks, I introduced her to the full reality of the listening places. "This changes everything," she said after her first ceremony at Listening Point. "Wilderness isn't the absence of humanity. It's relationship, connection that goes both ways." Aisha became one of my most trusted colleagues, passing on the knowledge to new rangers. Other things were changing too. Climate change accelerated, bringing more extreme weather. The Colorado River's flow diminished. Species distributions shifted. Human visitation continued to increase, bringing proposals for expanded facilities and even a tram system. I fought against these expansions using every bureaucratic tool available, never mentioning the real reason for my opposition. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. In my 20th year, Thomas died. At his funeral, Maria gave me something, a leather journal worn and stained from decades of use. Thomas's personal notes about the canyon, observations going back 50 years. "He wanted you to have this," she said. "Said you'd know what to do with the knowledge." I spent weeks reading that journal. He documented things I'd never encountered. Seasons when the listening places went completely silent. Years when echo walkers appeared with such frequency they were almost commonplace. He'd seen how cultural changes affected the canyon's consciousness. I began adding my own entries to his journal, continuing the record, maintaining the observation. Someday I'd give this journal to someone younger, Aisha perhaps, or another ranger who demonstrated the right sensibility. The knowledge needed to flow forward generation to generation, adaptation by adaptation. It happened in my 22nd year, a sequence of events that brought everything to a head and forced decisions none of us wanted to make. It started with the weather. An unusually wet spring fed the Colorado River to levels not seen in decades. The increased water flow changed the canyon's acoustics dramatically. Sounds that had been distinct became muddy and echoed. The listening places accustomed to consistent acoustic conditions began behaving erratically. Echo walkers appeared in places they'd never been seen before. People reported experiencing intense reflections at sites we'd never identified as listening places. The phenomena was spreading, becoming less predictable, harder to manage through subtle guidance. Then in mid-June, a group of hikers at one of the listening places all experienced the same vision simultaneously. All 5 of them saw the same echo walker. Not their own reflections, but a figure that looked like one of them but wasn't. They watched it walk past their campsite, pause to look at them all, then continue down the trail and disappear. The weird part was that the figure matched none of the 5 hikers exactly. It was a composite, wearing clothes from one with the facial features of another, moving with the gait of a third. As if the canyon had absorbed all 5 presences and blended them into something new. One of the hikers recorded video, and that video posted on social media went viral. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see the echo walkers. Tourist numbers spiked as people flooded to the canyon hoping to encounter the phenomenon. The listening places, already stressed by increased water flow, now received an unprecedented influx of attention. Thousands of people all looking for the same experience, all broadcasting their expectations and excitement and desire for transformation. The canyon couldn't handle it. The phenomena exploded. Echo walkers appeared constantly, everywhere, dozens of them visible simultaneously to anyone who looked. The reflections became less accurate, more chaotic. People saw versions of themselves that didn't match, heard voices saying things they'd never said, encountered presences that felt aggressive or frightening rather than merely reflective. It was exactly what we'd feared: oversaturation. The canyon's memory overwhelmed by input it couldn't properly process or contain. The awareness that had developed over millennia struggling under the weight of sudden massive attention. We had to close sections of the canyon, declared emergency conditions, restricted access, evacuated hikers from the backcountry. It was unprecedented. The Park Service demanded explanations that I couldn't give using official language. Geological instability, I reported, unusual conditions creating safety hazards. What kind of conditions? The regional director demanded over a conference call. We're still assessing, but visitor safety is compromised. We need the closures to remain in effect until we understand what's happening. There were threatened lawsuits, complaints from tourist businesses, pressure from politicians who represented districts where canyon tourism mattered economically. But I held firm, used every bit of authority my position granted, and refused to reopen the affected sections. Meanwhile, in private, we were trying everything we knew. Daily ceremonies at multiple listening places, attempting to help the canyon release the accumulated presence. Consultation with indigenous elders and academic researchers. Monitoring of the phenomena, looking for any sign of stabilization. Nothing worked. If anything, the situation intensified. The echo phenomena spread to areas previously unaffected. The deep stone I'd visited years ago, that ancient rock that had seemed beyond human influence, even that began showing signs of disturbance. Echoes appearing in places that shouldn't be able to record or reflect, as if the entire canyon was becoming one massive listening place. What if it's dying? Aisha asked during one of our emergency planning sessions. What if we're watching consciousness collapse under too much input? Or changing, Dr. Martinez suggested. He'd been visiting regularly since the crisis began, trying to understand what we were observing. Maybe it's not dying, but transforming. Adapting to a level of presence it was never designed to handle by becoming something different. Different how? I don't know. But complex systems under extreme stress either break down or reorganize at higher levels of complexity. What if the canyon is attempting the latter? It was an interesting theory, but it didn't tell us what to do. We couldn't reduce visitor presence significantly. The Park Service wouldn't allow closure beyond emergency periods. We couldn't perform ceremonies constantly that took time and people and conditions that weren't always available. We couldn't reverse climate change or restore the river's previous flow patterns. We were losing, watching something ancient and strange slowly overwhelmed by forces we couldn't control, armed only with partial understanding and limited authority. Then one night when I couldn't sleep and was sitting in my office reviewing data for the 1,000th time looking for patterns I'd missed, I had a realization. We'd been approaching this wrong, trying to reduce the canyon's input, help it release accumulated presence, return it to some previous stable state. But maybe that wasn't possible anymore. Maybe the canyon had passed a threshold, changed too fundamentally to go back. What if, instead of trying to restore the past, we helped facilitate transformation to something new? I called an emergency meeting. Every ranger who knew about the listening places, indigenous representatives from 3 different tribes, Dr. Martinez and 2 colleagues he'd brought in. Even Keiko's bighorn sheep data, which might provide insight into how the canyon's ecology was responding to the consciousness crisis. What if the canyon is trying to evolve? I proposed. What if all this chaos is actually a metamorphosis, and we're treating it like an illness when we should be treating it like birth? The room was silent as people considered this. Birth of what? Maria asked. I don't know. A new form of awareness, maybe. one adapted to constant human presence instead of occasional interaction. One that can handle saturation not by rejecting it, but by integrating it at a level of complexity we haven't seen before. That's very optimistic, one of the tribal elders said, but also dangerous. Facilitating transformation without knowing what you're transforming into is risky. Everything's risky at this point, I countered. Status quo isn't stable. Trying to return to previous conditions hasn't worked. At least this approach accepts change instead of fighting it. Dr. Martinez was nodding slowly. Emergence theory supports this. Complex systems under pressure don't just break or return to baseline. They sometimes reorganize at higher orders of complexity. New properties emerge that weren't present before. If the canyon's consciousness is sophisticated enough, it might be attempting exactly that kind of reorganization. So what would facilitating this look like? Aisha asked. We spent the rest of the night brainstorming. Instead of ceremonies to help the canyon release, we'd perform ceremonies to help it integrate. Instead of guiding people away from the listening places, we'd teach them how to interact intentionally, contributing presence that supported transformation rather than adding to chaos. Instead of trying to reduce overall visitation, we'd create protocols for mindful engagement that channeled attention in constructive ways. It was a massive shift in approach, and there was no guarantee it would work, but it felt right in a way our previous efforts hadn't. We were finally working with the canyon's nature instead of against it, accepting that change was inevitable and trying to shape it toward healthy outcomes instead of preventing it entirely. Implementation took months. We created new training for rangers, new educational materials for visitors, new ceremonies that honored transformation rather than preservation. Indigenous representatives taught us songs and protocols their peoples had used during times of great change. Dr. Martinez developed frameworks for understanding the emergence we were attempting to facilitate. And slowly, gradually, the chaos began to resolve into pattern. The echo walkers didn't disappear. If anything, they became more numerous. But their behavior changed. Instead of random appearances that frightened or confused people, they began moving in what looked like purposeful ways, walking established patterns, as if the canyon was using its reflections to communicate something about flow and movement and proper interaction with the space. People reported that following the echo walkers led them to particularly beautiful or meaningful spots, or helped them avoid hazards, or took them to places where they had profound experiences of connection and insight. The reflections were becoming guides rather than mere mirrors. The acoustic phenomena changed too. Instead of random echoes and overlapping voices, sounds began organizing into harmonics. People walking through certain sections heard music complex and beautiful, composed of their own footsteps and voices and breath woven together with the wind and water and the movements of others. The canyon was creating symphonies from accumulated presence, and the overall sense of consciousness became more distributed. Instead of concentrated intensely at specific listening places, awareness spread throughout the canyon in a more even field. You could feel it almost anywhere if you paid attention. Not overwhelming, not uncomfortable, just a gentle ongoing sense of being known and held within something vaster than yourself. The crisis had forced transformation, and what emerged was more sophisticated than what had existed before. The canyon had integrated all that overwhelming presence, learned to work with it instead of simply recording it, developed new capacities we were only beginning to understand. Dr. Martinez was ecstatic. "This is unprecedented," he told me during one of his research visits. "Documentation of consciousness emergence in real time. The canyon has essentially evolved a distributed intelligence that can process massive amounts of input simultaneously, by utilizing that very input as computational resource." It's using human attention itself as part of its awareness structure. That sounds almost parasitic, Aisha said, uncomfortable. Or symbiotic, he countered. The canyon gives back meaningful experiences, guidance, transformation. People give attention and presence. It's an exchange, a relationship that benefits both parties when conducted with respect. And that's what it had become, a genuine reciprocal relationship between place and people, between ancient geological consciousness and modern human awareness. Not without friction or misunderstandings, not always comfortable, but alive in ways I'd never imagined possible. The Park Service, unaware of the deeper dynamics, saw only that the emergency conditions had resolved. They wanted to reopen everything, return to normal operations, maximize access and revenue. I pushed back where I could, maintaining some restrictions, preserving some protected zones where the most intense transformation was still occurring. But overall, the canyon was open again, and visitors were having experiences they'd never imagined. The word spread. Not through official channels, we were careful never to advertise the phenomena explicitly, but through stories. Social media posts about profound moments, blog entries describing inexplicable encounters, video footage of echo walkers that scientists couldn't quite explain. The canyon was becoming known not just for its geological beauty, but for its consciousness, and people came seeking that, prepared for it in ways earlier visitors hadn't been, bringing intention and respect that helped the new integrated awareness stabilize and develop. In my 25th year at the canyon, I was offered a position at Park Service headquarters. More authority, higher salary, the ability to influence policy across the entire system. It was the kind of promotion people spent careers working toward. I turned it down. I belong here, I told the regional director who'd made the offer. This place and I have a relationship. I can't just leave for career advancement. She looked at me oddly. It's a canyon. A beautiful one, certainly, but just geography. You could protect it better from a headquarters position than you can from one site. I smiled. With respect, you're wrong. This specific canyon needs people who understand it intimately, who've spent years learning its patterns and nature. I'm more useful here than I could ever be anywhere else. After she left, I hiked out to the rim and looked down into the vast space I'd dedicated my adult life to understanding and protecting. The canyon spread before me in layers of color and shadow, beautiful beyond words, alive with awareness more profound than most people could imagine. The rocks don't speak, but they listen, and they remember. And now, after crisis and transformation, they engage. They participate actively in relationship with all who pass through them, offering reflection and guidance and connection to something vaster than human understanding. I was part of that now, woven into the canyon's consciousness as thoroughly as it was woven into mine. We'd changed each other across 25 years of interaction. I'd learned to perceive awareness in stone, and the canyon had learned to engage with humanity in new, more sophisticated ways. Neither of us were what we'd been. Both of us were better for the transformation. I'm 52 now, still working the canyon, though in roles that have adapted as my body has aged. Less backcountry patrol, more training and education. The journal Thomas gave me has grown thick with entries, observations spanning more than 70 years, waiting to be passed to the next worthy keeper. Aisha is chief of resource management now. Younger rangers come and go, learning what they need to learn, moving on or staying when the canyon gets its hooks in them deep enough. The indigenous partnerships have strengthened, with more tribal members working officially within the park system. The cellular towers that caused us such concern ended up being less disruptive than feared. The canyon's consciousness learned to filter digital presence differently than direct human attention. Another adaptation, another demonstration of sophisticated response to novel conditions, Climate change continues to alter the canyon. Hotter, drier, with less water flowing through the river. Species have moved to different elevations. The canyon's ecology is transforming and its consciousness is transforming with it. Last week I hiked down to the deepest accessible point again. Sat beside that ancient Vishnu basement rock and felt the vast, slow awareness I'd first encountered decades before. But something was different. For the first time, I felt like that deep awareness recognized me. Not as an individual, the timescales it operated on were too vast for that, but as a pattern that had repeated enough times to become notable. After 27 years of showing up, of paying attention, of learning and protecting, I'd finally existed long enough and consistently enough to register on the scale where the oldest stone maintains awareness. It was humbling beyond words, and oddly comforting. I'm part of that record now. My presence woven into the canyon's consciousness, my years of service recorded in layers of awareness that will persist long after my individual existence ends. Future rangers will walk trails I've maintained, pass listening places I've protected. The rocks don't speak, but they listen, and they remember, and they respond with sophistication that deepens the longer you pay attention, the more consistently you show up. I'm listening still. Will listen until I can't anymore. And then someone else will take up the practice, continuing the tradition of attention that helps this place remain both wild and aware, both ancient and evolving. That's enough. That's everything. That's the work.